The Human Perspective. Chapter 4. Noah. The story of a great flood that washed over the earth and destroyed everything around appears in all cultures. Today, we have evidence that suggests that this event happened historically. Due to this fact, the story of Noah is a mixture of the description of an actual event with a story that can teach us some lessons in it. In this investigation, I will leave aside the flood and the events that followed, as the flood itself is not adding anything of value to our inquiry. As we will see, the story around it is full of interesting descriptions and events. In some aspect, Noah was the first person to make an asymmetric investment and the first prophet in the book, in our days also known as a conspiracy theorist. We will approach the existence of God as the inner voice of Noah. Doing so will allow us to see the story from a different angle. As I mentioned previously, we are approaching the Bible from a poetic and not a religious perspective, allowing us to add value to the existing interpretations of the Bible. I believe a backward approach is needed to better understand Noah's story. The reason for such an act has to do with the nature of investments. Any good investment is validated only retrospectively. Any success story is built on the right decision made in a retrospective view. Moreover, and specifically in Noah's case, we know the story thanks to its success. After all, a failure of Noah to execute his plan would leave nobody behind to tell the story. As with all human events, the past has been sealed once an action has been made and executed. It is part of the human experience. If Noah had not acted exactly as he did, he wouldn't manage to survive the event, making any partial preparation irrelevant. The amount of time spent in the boat is described extensively. A long period passed in which the total ecosystem created in boat had to survive. As no technology existed to support such a trip, bringing less diversity of animals could result in general starvation. Additionally, it is easy to see how, in retrospect, we could say that Noah brought with him all the existing animals, as any missing variety would have been completely exterminated. Looking at life in that manner is the basis of how we present to future generations our history. We are aware only of the part that survived, making all the rest non-existent. Due to this, it is easy to say that since Noah was the only person left to tell his story and the originator of any future life, the surviving animal could be classified as all the animals. Back to the beginning. The story of Noah takes us to a distant future from Cain and Abel's period. A great emphasis is given to the passage of time, so much as to dedicate to it an entire chapter. This is not something we can ignore. The story of Adam and Eve is covered in 1.5 chapters, and Cain and Abel are in less than 1. The first story length is 27 paragraphs, and the second is 26 paragraphs, while 32 paragraphs exist between Cain and Noah's story. This gap is meaningful, showing us the process of evolution of the world and the time that has passed before the arrival of Noah. The story starts with the description of a change in the status quo. God decided that humans shouldn't live forever any longer and limited their lifespan to 120. Genesis 6:3. Then the Lord said, "My spirit shall not abide in mortals forever, for they are flesh. Their days shall be 120 years. This represents a change in attitude and the fabric of society, and it symbolizes the end of an era. This passage can be seen as a natural change happening over time, while in our case, it is God's decision to limit human longevity. Structural changes in society are inevitable over time. I believe that this decision can be seen as a general metaphor. God didn't punish humanity for a specific sin, nor did he act out of anger or frustration. It was a decision. It was made for the sake of itself. Many changes happened throughout the natural development of nature. These changes are seen in retrospect, as humans usually are sensitive not to the changes, but to their consequences. Not many people can become aware of these changes when they happen and react to them correctly. Over history, such people were identified as prophets, deities, shamans, philosophers, and in our days professors. As the story goes, the limitation of the human lifespan created legends which were celebrated and then forgotten. Over time and with the passing generations, human has forgotten their roots and the meaning of their existence. Genesis 6:4. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went into the daughters of humans, who bore children to them. These were the heroes that were of old, warriors of renown. The Lord saw that the wickedness of humankind was great in the earth, and that every inclination of the thoughts of their hearts was only evil continually. The first message we can learn from the story is the cyclicality of human existence. The Bible tells us that the first inevitable consequence of our mortality is the creation of heroes and their fall. This notion is ancient and has been called by the Roman a seculo, coming from the Latin word secula, meaning lifetime age. In their book, The Fourth Turning, William Strauss and Neil Howe present a strong case that a cyclicality seems to exist between generations, creating the rise and fall of cultures. In their book, they write, over a period of time, roughly 100 years, a world power emerges from a global war only to experience a gradual decay in its position of preponderance, writes Thompson. Global order decays at a parallel rate until a new global war occurs and facilitates the emergence of a new world power. The story says that God saw the corruption of man and was sorry he made humankind. It continues by describing a world of violence, aggression, and wickedness. It is written that, now the earth was corrupt in God's sight, meaning it wasn't corrupt objectively, but subjectively from God's perspective. The book added specifically, in God's sight, instead of on the earth. This distinction is important as it establishes the capacity of Neo to predict a possible disaster. Foresight is based on conviction, which is subjective, allowing only a believer of a certain doctrine to see the world in the way he does. The text continues and says that God favored Noah. Turning the order of things on his head, we can say that Noah was a believer and lived a life of a good person based on what he believed to be good. The story says that Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. This fact shows us that Noah had a set of values different from what he saw around him. As a true believer, he saw and judged the society around him as violent, corrupted, and wicked. The description of Noah backwardly is a classical description of a believer in any religion. Each has its core values and judgment on principle. The belief of a person in a specific religion automatically render all non-believers as bad, blasphemous, and evil. It has been a consistent phenomenon throughout the history of humans. It is very common for religious people to predict disaster for the non-believer. They see them as sinners and conclude that devastating outcomes will follow unless a general adoption is applied. Noah, as a believer, could not see it any differently. It is easy to understand how he could decide that a disaster should follow as the world went astray. It is the inevitable thought process of any person with a strong conviction. Predictions of this sort can be divided into two. One has a time limit, while the second doesn't. The reaction to the type of prediction is different. In the first case, the resources allocated to a potential outcome can be mitigated based on the failure criteria. It is limited in risk and allows flexibility. Betting on such an outcome is of low risk with a feedback loop. These bets and predictions are part of our daily experience and can be measured simply. The main criteria of such a prediction are the failure point, proving the mistake or wrongfulness of the bet. The second kind of prediction normally concerns extreme and abstract events. They don't have any failure criteria. They normally include horrible ends and require an alignment and immediate actions. In this case, taking bets are considered to be asymmetric in case they are right, making them worth considering. Generally, a certain amount of religious belief is needed, and some principles based on debate. Facts are included. Two practical examples from our current day and age can be the global warming movement and the great financial crisis of 2008. The global warming example represents the second kind of prediction. Its extreme believers cannot ignore the idea that a disaster will happen if their observations are taken to their inevitable end. As long as the disaster does not occur, it is possible to believe in its inevitability. Time is not a real function of this prediction, making it external as long as people are willing to believe in it. The second example represents the first kind of prediction. In 2008, investors that saw the turn and crunch in the financial system before the global financial crisis in 2008. Some made bets based on their convictions, suffered humiliation while waiting for what they saw to be inevitable, and cashed out when the crash happened. A great book that has been later on made into a movie is The Big Short, Inside the Doomsday Machine by Michael Lewis. The readings present this scenario in a lovely way. It is important to emphasize that people with convictions cannot help but to arrive at their end conclusion about the events of the future, while some are right and get retrospective admiration for it. In most cases, a conviction does not promise rightfulness. Many prophets and investors have been shown to be false prophets. The Book of Prophets is full of examples of such cases. The interesting and extremely luxurious aspect of having conviction and executing upon it happens when the bet can be seen as an asymmetric bet, meaning that one has little to lose from implementing a bet and everything to win in case he is right. As we will see in our current story, it can be said that Noah is a classic example of it. Let's conclude the event up to this point in Noah's story. The world has changed. This is noticed by mentioning that there are no more immortals. Additionally, the community lost its way, creating a world full of suffering and violence. Noah, a believer in the way of the good, sees all the chaos around and concludes that a disaster is on its way. In his meditations, he gets illumination and decides to build a boat, and not just a boat, a big one. The story describes a very specific list of the boat's materials, measurements, and requirements. By itself, it is not very surprising, as when a person has a vision or an illumination, a very specific picture is presented in one mind. Thinking of bringing his family with him seems logical. After all, each person that loves his family and predicts a disaster will try to save his family. Then there is the two-animal idea as part of his vision. It makes a lot of sense. Any person knowing he will have to be locked up in a place for an extended period will consider food for survival. Bringing two of each animal is a responsible act, as it allows continuity and a food source for an extended period. As the chapter finishes, Noah executes his plan and builds his ark. As the story goes, Noah was right. The flood arrives and wipes out all that exists on the earth. The rest of the story is known to all and describes the de facto events that followed the disaster, as it is a description of an event without any significant development. As I mentioned earlier, the story is told retrospectively, meaning that the notion that all existing animals before the flood have been saved is no more than saying that all the animals known today to humans originated from the ark. It is a logical conclusion, as we will never know what existed before the flood that didn't survive. What can we learn from this story? First is the power of conviction and the importance of taking your principle to their end. Many people live their lives confused and without a strong belief in principles. It is true today more than ever. The incapacity to have a clear vision of one's own beliefs makes people weak and confused, allowing the waves of temporary society to throw the person from side to side toward despair and mental corruption. The need for core beliefs and the power to live by them allow a person to see the world clearly. Not always in the correct way, but clearly. In the age of relativism, the capacity of many people to have a clear idea of what or why they are walking a certain way is limited. A society that does not have community principles is a broken society. Principle and uniting beliefs allow people to see the bigger picture. One, they unite people instead of keeping them apart. This kind of unity reinforces the capacity of individuals to see beyond their needs and give them a vision, preventing violence and disintegration of society. The story teaches us about the power of conviction. This capacity gives a person the tools needed to calculate his risks and make decisions based on a mental structure that is based on conviction. This conviction and confidence are required in order to execute any difficult plan and stand firm in difficult times. The capacity of a person to execute his plan is based on conviction. Execution in the face of difficulty is not easy. Regardless, one can only arrive from nowhere to somewhere by surpassing one's difficulty. Humanity has evolved and developed to be what it is today, only thanks to individuals' capacity to execute their plan with conviction. Building the ark took time and was visible to the people around. The people around him could not ignore the size of the boat and the resources needed. As he was the only person doing so, it is easy to assume that some people started to ask questions around and ridicule the effort and thought of the act. After all, if any sane person would believe the theory of Noah, he, in his turn, would start building an ark as well. Having the capacity to execute a decision regardless of the ridicule and the doubt that arise in the process is not obvious. It requires inner strength, deep belief, and determination. Many people are busy explaining to everyone why they are wrong and why nothing should be done. It is easier to follow passively than lead actively. The aspect of time also plays an essential role in this story. When making decisions, a certain length of time usually passes between the actions taken by an individual and the discovery of the outcome. Doubt is an enemy of each person's set of beliefs. The capacity to ignore doubt and move forward is not always evident and needs to be appreciated. It is true that many, if not in most cases, we will discover to be wrong in our prediction. It is a natural part of the process, allowing us to tune our thoughts and teach us where we were wrong. The fact that in many cases our conviction is incorrect doesn't offset the need for one. The process of decision-making is complicated. As we will see in the second lesson of the story, the question is not if one was wrong, but what is the risk on balance? I came to believe that for most life cases, if addressed with humility, it is better to make decisions and be wrong than not make decisions at all. The second lesson in the story concerns asymmetric bets. It is one of the most important lessons one can learn about the decision-making process. Noah could dwell on his dissatisfaction with the world around him or get bitter. Nevertheless, he has a vision and decides to act. The asymmetricity in his act is a lesson in decision-taking in everyday life, one that addresses the calculation of odds in each of the options. This way of thinking is constructive and can help a person navigate his life in the complexity of his path, learning how to take risks favorably and decide when to act. The principle is simple and straightforward. When standing before a decision, a risk-reward needs to be calculated. Sometimes the calculation is not clear, making the decision more complicated. In these cases, it would be favorable not to rush and take action. Conversely, in some events, there is an unproportional risk-reward balance. It always requires conviction in a person's belief, an aspect that will always be put to the test in the process of waiting for the outcome. Noah's story is a great example. As Noah predicts a disaster, he stands in a dilemma: build the boat or do nothing. By building the boat, Noah put himself in a favorable position. In case he is wrong, he spent time and effort, which it seems he has plenty of. If no disaster happens, Noah will live in his medium surrounded by his loved ones, as he did until now, looking at his boat parked in his backyard. On the other side, in case a disaster occurs, he will be safe while the rest of humanity dies. Noah faces total destruction if the disaster comes and the boat is not there. The risk-reward is clear, and a boat should be built. Noah's story is a story about decision-making and the calculation of odds. The lessons are relevant to all humans of all ages. The capacity to understand the odds and execute a plan is crucial for the prosperity of an individual. The concept of asymmetric bets is not part of our modern education. Integrating this knowledge into the worldview of a person can be a crucial tool in his development, while the majority of people are working daily to create themselves a better future. Knowing how to identify asymmetric decisions can be a game changer for many people. Analysis of situations, calculation of risks, and the capacity to execute upon it is a lesson that all humans can benefit from regardless of their circumstances.